Everybody in Capstone 3. I am so excited to be making this presentation today. I cannot believe that we are here at the end of our master's degree program. It has gone by so quickly for me, and I've just really enjoyed learning a lot throughout this program. I feel like I've gotten to know some of you pretty well through discussion forums and group projects, but I know that there are so many of you that I do not know at all, and I look forward to hearing hopefully from some of you and getting some feedback on this presentation. And I'm also looking forward to reviewing other people's presentations and seeing what you all have chosen to focus your study on. I have chosen to study the topic of polygamy, and I know that this is a very controversial topic, and I also have complicated feelings towards the issue. On the one hand, some of my ancestors were polygamists, so I would not be here if not for polygamy. So I'm a product of polygamy and I'm grateful to be alive. But on the other hand, polygamy is not a lifestyle that I would choose for myself. But I can see why other people would make that choice. So it's been interesting for me to do more research, and especially as I focus on the scholarly side of polygamy and read a lot of research articles, I've come to believe that legalizing polygamy would be the best course of action that we could take here in America. I feel like that would really improve outcomes for those American families who do choose to practice polygamy and currently have their lifestyle criminalized and suffer a lot of negative effects from that. My goal today, as we go through this presentation, would be to help you all understand a little bit about the history of polygamy in America, and to see some of the negative effects associated with polygamy and how I believe that legalizing polygamy could help alleviate some of those associated problems with polygamy. I want to define the term polygamy so everyone knows exactly what I'm talking about. Polygamy is the practice of having more than one spouse or partner simultaneously. The most common type of polygamy is polygyny, where a man has multiple wives. Less common is polyandry, in which a woman has multiple husbands. The term bigamy is also sometimes used. Maybe some of you have also heard that. That's a term that's especially used in state statutes to describe this practice of having multiple spouses. For simplicity, I'm just going to use the term polygamy throughout this presentation to describe the practice of a man having more than one wife. Polygamy is a practice that's been around since the very beginning of time, since time immemorial. There are records of many ancient people living polygamous lifestyles. It was accepted in ancient Hebrew society, in Islam, in classical China, in India, and in traditional African and Polynesian cultures. Today, polygamy is practiced in over 850 societies around the globe. It's legal in many African and Middle Eastern countries, including Kenya, Uganda, Yemen, Pakistan, and more. But it is illegal in many Western nations, including America. Here in America, polygamy has been gathering a lot of the national attention the past few years. It's the subject of several hit TV shows, some reality shows such as My Five Wives and Sister Wives, and it's the subject of a fictional TV show, Big Love. Maybe some of you have seen these. It's been written about. Polygamy has been discussed in memoirs and exposés, newspaper articles. It's been showcased in talk shows and documentaries. That's kind of what sparked my interest in polygamy. I've seen it discussed in the popular media. I've actually read all of these books and quite a few other ones. I think I've read every book that my local library has about polygamy because I find it so interesting. In 2015, this Gallup poll showed that increasing numbers of Americans find polygamy to be permissible. In 2001, just 7% of Americans indicated that they believed polygamy is morally acceptable, but in 2015, that number increased to 16%, representing a 9% change in just the span of a few years. Polygamy is affecting more and more Americans all the time. It's just becoming increasingly more relevant, and important. And I know that 16% of Americans is still not a huge number, but as I'm going to show you throughout this presentation, it's just getting more and more important to discuss this topic now. Before we get into the specifics of why the practice should be legalized, we first need to briefly review the history of polygamy in America. Polygamy first became an issue in America in the mid-1800s. Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church, believed that God had, as in biblical times, restored the practice of polygamy and commanded them to begin practicing it. Many Americans are aware that members of the LDS Church practice polygamy, but they might not know that the practice was never very widespread. Even at its peak, no more than 20% of members of the LDS Church practiced polygamy. The number of men permitted to take multiple wives was low, because men had to be morally and financially stable. Thus, it was practiced more among the leadership of the church than just among the general masses. Even though the practice was limited, the United States government took notice that this was going on, and it was opposed and condemned by the government. It was just seen as barbaric and something that should not be taking place in the New World. In 1862 is when the first anti-polygamy legislation was passed. It was called the Morrill Act for the Suppression of Polygamy, and this act would fine polygamists up to $500 and could jail them for up to 5 years. The Morrill Act also attempted to weaken the LDS Church by revoking the church's incorporation and by limiting the church's ability to own property. However, the LDS members who practiced polygamy were not stopped by the Morrill Act. They grew just more steadfast in defense of their families and their religious beliefs. They just kept on practicing polygamy, so Congress took further action in 1874 by passing the Poland Act, which limited the jurisdiction of the Utah County Courts. Then in 1882, the Edmunds Anti-Polygamy Act was passed, and this act actually prohibited just cohabitation, which made it a lot easier for prosecutors to convict polygamists because they no longer needed proof of an actual marriage between a man and his individual wives. So because of this, they were increasingly prosecuting members of the LDS Church. Like you can see in this picture taken in 1886, there's a lot of people arrested, and a lot of people went into hiding to avoid going to prison or testifying against family members. A lot of families were split up because of this. And finally, Congress passed the Edmunds-Tucker Act in 1887. This act dealt a heavy blow to the LDS Church. It forfeited all of the church's property worth over $50,000 to the federal government. After a good deal of thought, prayer, counseling among leaders of the LDS Church, Wilford Woodruff, who was then the current president of the LDS Church, he urged all members to stop performing polygamous marriages. This is what he said, quote, "Inasmuch as laws have been enacted by Congress forbidding plural marriages, which laws have been pronounced constitutional by the court of last resort, I hereby declare my intention to submit to those laws and to use my influence with the members of the church over which I preside to have them do likewise." End quote. He asserted that God no longer required these unions to be performed and that the church intended to comply with the laws of the land. Partly because of his willingness to comply with the laws of the land and stop practicing polygamy, Utah, where most of the members of the LDS Church lived at the time, was able to become a state in 1896. The church had gone astray. These groups of people continued to practice polygamy. They felt that they should still continue to perform new plural marriages and live in their plural families. These groups today are mostly located throughout the western part of the United States. This is a couple of pictures of some polygamous groups. There's a man and his wives, and then a man and all of his large posterity right here in this image. The government was not pleased that the practice of polygamy was continuing even after it had been made illegal. Between 1900 and the early 1950s, the government would engage in periodic raids on known polygamous communities. The most infamous of these raids took place in 1953, and it served as the turning point in the enforcement of polygamy laws. Arizona Governor John Howard Pyle ordered a raid on the community of Short Creek, Arizona in 1953. Just before dawn, 102 public safety officers and soldiers from the Arizona National Guard arrived in the community of Short Creek. 100 men were arrested, 85 women, and 263 children were taken into protective custody. The Short Creek raid proved to be a public relations disaster. Major newspapers showcased pictures of young children in prairie-style dresses weeping as they were taken from their parents, and the American public did not respond favorably to those images or to other media coverage at the time. The backlash was so bad that every single one of the arrested men was released a short time later. However, 150 children were not returned to their parents for over 2 years. Some parents never regained custody of their children. Governor Pyle was heavily criticized for interfering and taking children from their parents. He lost his bid for re-election and blamed the public outcry over the raid for ruining his political career. Even after the Short Creek Raid, the practice of polygamy could not be squelched. Instead, polygamists retreated further underground. Many moved to secretive and isolated compounds. Polygamists became increasingly more distrustful of the government officials and just of all outsiders. Everyone who wasn't part of their polygamous community, they distrusted. They saw as outsiders who did not have their best interests at heart. They saw them as people who were out to get them and that did not understand their lifestyle. This is a picture of a polygamous compound in El Dorado, Texas. It's completely separated from the rest of the society. It's all fenced in and very secretive. I made this little graphic to help sum up the history of polygamy so far. A few people began practicing it here in America, so the government reacted by making it illegal and trying to end the practice. Polygamists reacted by cloistering themselves away and by becoming secretive. They just became highly isolated from the outside world. With early mortality, and it's a factor associated with cults. One of the main ways that polygamous families are affected by isolation is that polygamous leaders, such as Warren Jeffs, have a lot of power and control over their people. This can lead to brainwashing of the individuals and families affected, and it creates a climate where crimes are occurring out of the private eye because these communities are so separate from the rest of the world. Even the police force in these communities are usually controlled by the polygamous leaders, so there's just not a lot of outside intervention there. This has just continued to put scores of individuals at risk of underage marriage, non-consensual marriage, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and even limited educational opportunities. Many are familiar with Warren Jeffs, which is why I included him in this PowerPoint. When people think about polygamy, he's usually one of the first people that they think about. Warren Jeffs was on the FBI Most Wanted list and arrested in 2006. And he was convicted of incest, being an accomplice to rape, and even child sexual abuse. Has still chosen to largely ignore isolated communities, even though women and children are remaining at risk. Jeffs is in prison, but there are other abusers still out there that have great power and control over these polygamous families. Lack of governmental oversight has been labeled secular eye winking. The government is reluctant to get involved because they fear negative repercussions of getting too involved, as was the case with the Short Creek Raid. It's also very difficult to prosecute polygamists, which is one reason why the government just kind of stays out of it. It's so challenging for law enforcement officials to make a case. Polygamists are typically legally married to only their first wife, and the subsequent wives are taken in private religious ceremonies that don't leave any paper trail or record. So then when abuse is occurring, it's very difficult for the government to find witnesses who are willing to testify against perpetrators. The witnesses themselves are afraid of being prosecuted for being polygamists. So when the government is wanting to prosecute a polygamist who is causing abuse, it's just so hard to prove because everyone who is aware that the abuse was going on is afraid to appear in court because their own lifestyle is not protected. It's just kind of a bad situation. But when the government does ignore these polygamous communities and the abuses that occur there, it's indirectly condoning and perpetuating this abuse and neglect to women and children. Two different fundamentalist polygamous groups for a period of 18 months concluded that polygamy is no more likely to lead to abuse than monogamy. That's so important, I'm going to say it again. Polygamy is no more likely to lead to abuse than monogamy. I think it is so important to remember that not all polygamists are evil or bad or wicked or wrong. Not all polygamists are rapists or child molesters or criminals in any way. Many polygamists are good people, just like not all monogamists are good people. Some monogamists are bad people and commit the same crimes that are associated with polygamy. Polygamy itself is not a cause for crime, it's just an alternative family structure. Being a polygamist doesn't mean that someone will automatically marry children or beat their wives. What causes those problems is isolation. When people are isolated from mainstream society and when bad people are then in control of these isolated communities, that's when the negative effects occur. Believe that rather than legalizing polygamy, it should be further criminalized, that every polygamist should be rounded up and sent to jail, but that just is not feasible, and many Americans would not be in favor of that anyway. But bringing the practice into the open would have benefits. It will improve the relationship between polygamists and the government, and it will help those in isolation have access to the wider world and outside resources. People who do live within these isolated communities will be able to go outside those communities without fear of being prosecuted for their lifestyle choices. They'll be able to get different jobs, to go to different schools, to mingle with people that do not share their same religious convictions about polygamy, but nevertheless are good people. They'll be able to see that not all outsiders or government officials are trying to get them. They're not all trying to arrest them or send them to jail just for choosing to be polygamists. Groups of the LDS Church that I've mentioned, there are also groups of Muslim American polygamists that live primarily along the east coast of the United States. The United States is receiving thousands of immigrants each year from countries that permit polygamy. In 2007, nearly 500,000 immigrants obtained permanent resident status from polygamous countries in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Many of these families value polygamy as an important religious and cultural practice that's now illegal in their new country. These families will now, of necessity, have to hide an important part of their lives for fear of being stigmatized or criminalized. In addition to the polygamists who are already here and the polygamists who are immigrating here, one factor to consider is the fact that polygamists have very large families, much larger than the national average, and their birth rate is very high, so the number of polygamists in this country will only continue to increase. It can be very difficult to obtain reliable census data because most polygamists want to keep their status a secret. But in 2008, it was estimated that there are 30,000 to 100,000 polygamists in America. And I do recognize that this is a number with a lot of variance in it. 30,000 to 100,000, that's a huge gap. But that was the best, most reliable estimate that could be obtained by scholars who seek to understand just how much this problem is affecting American society. Some polygamists do just live in mainstream society and they are open about the fact that they have multiple wives, but others choose to hide it, those that live in mainstream society. They don't want their neighbors to know that they might have a second wife. And then, of course, there are so many polygamists that do live in just those isolated communities with only other polygamous families. Those are some of the reasons why it's very difficult to know just how many polygamists there are. And, of course, polygamists typically have large families, much larger than the national average family, and therefore their birth rates just go up kind of exponentially. There's growing numbers of polygamists. Polygamists have a place in American history, and they believe strongly in their right to live the practice. They have proven their willingness to fight for their lifestyle despite governmental and societal persecution. Utah's Attorney General Mark Shurtleff said this about polygamists, quote, "This is a big group of people. They are not going away. You can't incarcerate them all. You can't drive them out of the state. So they are here. What can we do about it? Polygamists are here to stay." Legalizing polygamy will improve outcomes for American families. It will bring the practice into the open, and those living in isolation will be less afraid of government officials and outsiders. They will no longer have to fear being prosecuted for their lifestyle, and they'll have greater access to outside resources and supports. I propose that we create regulations based off of other countries who successfully regulate the practice. We can require that each marriage within a polygamous union is properly documented. Those who desire to wed should be able to legally register their marriage as polygamous with the option of adding or removing spouses over the course of the marriage. Legal recognition will dignify this choice. It will equalize it with monogamy. And making polygamy legal in America will send strong messages of religious freedom, acceptance, and equality, principles that many Americans hold dear. Proponents of polygamy gathered to protest that polygamy is illegal. They went to gather attention for their cause and to show what they believe to advocate for polygamy to be legalized. You can see in the back someone holding a sign, "I love all my moms." Someone else on the right holding a sign, "My family, my choice." Someone on the left with a sign that says, "You think I'm brainwashed? I think you are bigoted. Let's talk." And my personal favorite sign right in the front says, "Families, not felons." I really like that message. Families, not felons. And I would urge all of us to consider creating and implementing regulations in America to oversee the practice of polygamy, to regulate the practice, to legalize it, to bring it into the open, to improve outcomes for all of these American families. Thank you for allowing me to present this information to you today. This is a list of the resources that I have used.